everybody, Gary Main Brew Guy. I'm going to talk about a two-tier brewing system today and explain the mash process. Also, we're going to go over the plumbing on a two-tier brewing system, or HERMS in my case. So stay tuned for that. But while we're doing that, I'm going to check out this beer from Wrecked Brewing. It's his 4-poured pale ale. I've had it for a little while. So here we go on the Trool cam. Looks like it's coming out pretty clear. Looks like it's well carbonated. And Matt's doing the pounders. So yeah, Matt, that's looking really clear, as you guys can see there in the Trool cam. Okay. Oh, that smells really nice. 6.3%, 35 IBUs. This was way back in February, by the way. Very clean smelling beer. Nice citrus. Here we go. Oh, Matt, that held up really nice. It really did. So yeah, let's get into this HERMS video now. So I want to talk to the all-grain brewer that's just getting started. Don't let all this equipment intimidate you. So for you guys starting out, new all-grain brewers, you're probably not going to start out with a big system like this. It's taken me 12 years to get here. Not exactly. I've been brewing with the system for a few years, and it's evolved over time. But my point is that we all started on, most of us all started out on the stove. We all transitioned to a partial mash, and then maybe all grain with some, one boil kettle, a turkey fryer, and 2 coolers. Trust me, can make award-winning beer with that setup, no problem. These systems just help with repeatability. It helps with ease of brewing, and frankly, it's fun to build, unless you buy your own, of course. When you're in a cooler, there's no real need to recirculate the mash. The mash should hold its temperature fairly well in a cooler, and that's the beauty of using a cooler. So once you strike in your initial water and you get your initial mash temperature and you put the lid on the cooler, that's it. You let it set for an hour and you're done. And the mash is complete. You'll get to the point where you'll just be running off after you do what's called a Vorloff.
Now let's go ahead and Vorloff. Vorloffing is the filtering of the grains from ending up in our boil kettle. See, we want to minimize the grains that snuck through our false bottom. We don't want the grains in our kettle, just the sugar from them.
So when you recirculate the mash, during the mashing process, you're actually cutting out a step. The Vorloffing has already been done for you. That's one of the beauties about a recirculating mash. Secondly, we're not using a cooler anymore because the coolers are you're only allowed so much space in a cooler, and then if you want to go bigger, you're going to have to go stainless steel kettles, which would require you to have something to continually recirculate the mash water whilst heating it back up again to the correct temperature so that the mash maintains the proper temperature while doing the Vorloff at the same time. Okay, and that's usually done in 2 ways. That's a HERMS system, which is a heat exchange recirculating infusion mash, or a RIMS system, which is direct heating of the wort, and that's a recirculating infusion mash. But the RIMS system just uses an element in a tube, and it passes the wort through the heating element and heats it back to temperature before going back into the mash. A HERMS system utilizes a giant 50-foot coil in the mash bath, in the HLT rather, and in the HLT, the coil is at temperature and begins recirculating the wort through the coil, heating it back up to the desired set point, back into the mash. And this process continues over and over again, typically for 20-30 minutes or more even. I like to shut mine down about 15 minutes prior to mash out. That gives me time to raise the HLT. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the pump on and the pump, and we'll follow the plumbing on this. And that shows the whole recirculating process. So here we go. All right, so any recirculating mash system is going to have a pump, at least one. Two-tier systems can get away with one pump. Single-tier systems will need two. Now that was one of the other reasons why I went with a two-tiered system. Okay, now you'll see an extra thing here. I was running some tests with this. This is why this is like that. The inlet on the pump is on this side. I utilize three-way valves for a specific purpose, and that is so that once I hook up all my hoses, I'm not switching hoses around during the brewing process. So right now, as you can see, the arrows are pointing from this to the inlet, and then out of the pump it's going this way. And if you follow that line, it's going to the base of the HLT, which in the base of the HLT is the bottom of the coil, which is a sealed system that pops out at the top, comes out of this, and then goes into here. There's a thermal probe here monitoring that temperature and adjusting the HLT so that the wort that's coming across this probe is at the correct temperature. Then it goes in here over the manifold and sprinkles down through the mash, out through the bazooka screen and false bottom, back down the hose into the pump. So that is a recirculating mash. So let's take a look inside and what that looks like. That's one thing about having kettles uninsulated, and they lose heat very quickly. So we're going to break away here, and I'm going to break down the mash process. A little technical, but we're not going to get too crazy. If you've gotten this far into this video, you probably already know that this is barley. Barley comes in two forms, 2-row, 6-row. Also, another grain we use more commonly is wheat. The nice thing about our grains of today, they are well modified. In other words, once they are harvested, they are taken to the maltster where they are allowed to germinate and then kilned, and then the rootlets are removed. Bringing the grains to us at this point, we need to crack them open. Once we crack them open, we're allowed to get to those carbohydrates stored within the endosperm. Once we're in the mash with these crushed grains, we are allowed to convert these to sugars usable to the yeast. Back in the day, before they were well modified, we had to do this beta glucanase rest and this protein rest. And now with the modified grains of today, we can use this red mash target area here, single step. Basically, we only need to bring the water to one temperature, whatever temperature we desired based on the recipe, typically between 148 and 156 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you mash in the lower end, like in the beta amylase range, then your beer could be very, very thin and dry due to the fact that these would be more usable, basically more usable to the yeast, as they would be probably in the more shorter chain usable sugars. Where if you were in the alpha amylase range, then those would be more of the longer chain sugars like the maltose, things of that nature, where the yeast don't easily use them and produced alcohol with it. So if you're up there in the range of, let's say, 160, your beer could end up being very, very sweet. So most of us stay in this red target area, and that would be where we are today for the mash in this video. I hope this is a pretty good explanation of what's going on in the mash tun. We have the alpha and the beta going on, yada yada, and over the, in my case, 75 minutes of mash, because I'm using a Pilsner, so I just like a little extra time. You can mash for 2 days if you want. Nah, probably not 2 days, but you can mash for 2 hours anyway, and it's not going to change anything. Probably start using the protein rest moving forward. I've flirted with the idea a few times. We lost a really knowledgeable brewer quite a few years back now, Paul Wicksteed. He swore by the protein rest. Now, back then there was no hazy IPAs, so everybody was trying to produce a very clear beer. And there's some evidence that if you do a protein rest, you could end up with a clearer beer in the end. Even though these grains are well modified, there's still some loose scientific data that suggests that it may help. And I think Scott Janisch talks about this in his book as well. I will try those with West Coast IPAs and, you know, pale lagers and pilsners, Kolsch's and blondes, anything that I'm looking to get clear. So what's next here is the mash out process. Currently, I'm very early in the mash. I'm only 6 minutes into a 75-minute mash. So we'll come back at the end when we're ready to mash out. So this is what we're calling mash out. So you see the wort is coming from the bottom of the kettle. We'll follow those arrows. Bottom of the mash tun rather, into the bottom of the boil kettle. And then we have the pump on, so we're also infusing water from here in through the manifold over the top. In fact, I'll slow that down a little because it looks like it might be going a little fast. So then we can throttle that back here with a shutoff valve. So the goal here is to make sure that we don't send too much water into the mash tun. So we have to keep an eye on how much we're coming down here in the HLT, in my case. In other cases, what you would do is that you, for instance, my mash out requires 4.06 gallons of water. You would take that amount on the stove, bring it to 172 degrees, and then rinse the grains until all of that water is gone. Makes it very accurate for you. You can do the same here, just got to watch it. And if you don't, you'll over sparge, which means you're not going to hit your numbers. And your numbers being your pre-boil gravity and then your final gravity. Now you can make small adjustments. If you know what your pre-boil gravity should be and you're a little low, you can increase the boil a little bit, the boil rate, to make up for it. Basically concentrating the wort a little more, evaporating some off to hit your numbers. So some of us brewers will do that if our pre-boil is low. If it's high, and then we may boil a little slower, less of a vigorous boil. You can play with the boil that way. It's not best to do that because that does change the recipe a little bit. If you boil vigorously, it changes as opposed to not as vigorous. Also can caramelize a little more of the wort, or there's a word for it, and I can't think of it off the top of my head at the moment, but I'll put it up here. Anyway, that happens, and if you overboil or you boil hard with a very vigorous boil, I should say. And underboiling, you could risk a little lighter wort than you would normally get, and also you could risk not having the volatiles blow off like you would hope, especially with Pilsner malt. So I have a gallon more to go here, and then I'll be done. And then whatever I collect is what I collect. And at the moment, we're just approaching where the element, where the wort is approaching the element level. So you can see there, it's coming up to the element. And now this is just going to drain through the grains and rinse the grains out as much as it can. And at the end, we'll probably have collected 8.5 gallons, 8.75 gallons. And then we boil that down to about 6.5 gallons. So now that I've covered the element, I can certainly start the boil, which I will beer. Yeah, Matt, that's really nice. You're gonna have to leave a comment about this beer in the video here. Anyway, what I didn't go over, and I probably should have when I was making that video, is I went over the fly sparging process. Well, the batch sparging process is pretty similar, except that you let all the initial mash water, the sweet wort, You let that flow out into the kettle. Then you add the entire 4.06 gallons, or what was it, 15.36 liters back in over the grains that have been completely drained. So what you would then do is shut the valve off and not allow that to drain out. You would batch in that entire amount of hot liquor, or water in this case, at 172 degrees, 78 degrees Celsius. And then you would stir that, and so you would get it all mixed in there really well. Some people don't stir it, but some do. And then once it's stirred, then you would begin that Vorloffing process again, where you're pouring the grains, you're pouring some of the mash water out, and you're setting the grain bed back. Basically, the bits of grain that are going to come out as you're Vorloffing, you're going to put them back over the top of the mash tun. Some people will use a at the top there, as you saw in my video there, which was plagiarized from someone else's video on YouTube, and you can catch the grains that way, but there's no point. You can just pour them right back over the grain bed. They'll not come through. The grain bed will compact and settle, and once the Vorloff is run clear, then you would allow that to go into the kettle and drain completely out. That is a batch sparge. The batch sparges are known to be a little more efficient, so if you're trying to bring your efficiency up, that's a nice way to do it. The only problem with batch sparging is that it takes longer in the brew day because you're Vorloffing twice. Secondly, when you're using a two-tiered system like I'm using, then you would have to recirculate again to repeat clearing out the grains, similar to what a Vorloff would do. So it is more time consuming, and frankly, the small improvement that you would make on efficiency is not really worth the additional time. So that's pretty much it. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you like it, please give me a thumbs up or subscribe. Also, if you have any comments or things that I didn't mention, remember this is a very basic video on two-tier and mashing. I didn't get too in depth. I didn't want to bore everybody with the details, okay? So if I missed or glossed over something, it was intentional. Anyway, Matt, thank you so much for this beer, and cheers, guys. Till the next video.
Thank you to our sponsors: Imperial Yeast, 5 Star Chemicals, Beer and Wine Hobby Homebrew Supply Store, Brewing America, all stainless steel mash paddle sponsors. Also Hopsteiner and Yakima Chief Hops. Get brewing.